And in Montana, we have over 20,000 points we've visited through every vegetation type you can imagine. And this is where we got the information to understand that there are some things that are relatively restricted to severely burned forest conditions. They simply don't occur anywhere else.
Welcome, wild ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. For this episode, our guest is Richard Hutto. Richard is an emeritus professor in biology and wildlife biology at the University of Montana and author of the newly released book, A Beautifully Burned Forest: Learning to Celebrate Severe Forest Fire. Welcome to the Green Root Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Well, I was psyched when the book came out. I know Thomas Veblen because I'm here in Colorado. And I believe he was a part of it in some way, right? I'm not sure.
Exactly. We've communicated over the years for sure. Yeah, and published stuff together.
Excellent. Well, he is a wildfire ecologist. And anyway, I'm excited about the book. I have read thus far just the introduction, but that's definitely enough to get me hooked. And that's going to be the next book on my list for sure.
Right.
So obviously, A Beautifully Burned Forest: Learning to Celebrate Severe Forest Fire. It's pretty clear what the topic is about. But let me start off by asking you, so why should anyone care about burned forests? Because we've been told that they're dead, they're devoid of life, they're fire traps, and they're just plain ugly, right? So what's going on?
That's why I chose the title as it exists. It's kind of an oxymoron, a beautifully burned forest. It's like, what? Yeah, nobody thinks a beautifully burned forest. That's insane. They're destroyed. It's a sea of death and destruction. I mean, what do you mean a beautifully burned forest? But if you take the time to go into these forests, or if you're lucky like me and have 20 or 30 years to study birds, in my case, my emphasis was birds, what you discover is something really fascinating, and that is that there are plants and animals and mushrooms that occur in abundance in burned forests, particularly severely burned charcoal forests. And here's what's wild: they don't occur anywhere else for the most part. So they're relatively restricted to this particular forest condition. And that to me says something really interesting. You can't be restricted to a condition if that condition was not, present for hundreds or thousands of years. And you've evolved a behavior that allows you to restrict your distribution to that particular habitat type that you're associated with. Whether you're a plant and then a seed and you only germinate under certain circumstances, or you're a beetle that has infrared heat detectors and you colonize areas that are severely burned, or whether you're a blackback woodpecker whose back is black and matches the organism against the tree trunk it's sitting on. I mean, all these things just scream fire, and they scream severe fire. And so what it's telling us is these sorts of events are natural, and not only natural, but necessary. And so at a time when we're being told everything's out of whack and forests never burn severely, and we need to do whatever we can to reduce the severity, and maybe it was understory burning, but nothing more than that. No, not at all. And this is true. My area of research is in the Western United States, and I'm talking about mixed conifer forests. So these are conifer forests, not so much there in Colorado where you are, but as you go a little farther north into Wyoming and North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, and down through the Sierras, that horseshoe there, all of that area, the mixed conifer forest, this applies. And that's about 85% of all the conifer forests in the Western United States. And so this is where this magic happens. And it's a magical thing because when a severe fire burns through, what you get is a transition to a brand new state with lots of different critters and plants and things in there. And so this is the magic, and this is what I am writing about. And what hit me is not just the biology and how cool it is and how evolutionarily interesting this is, how ecologically important it is, but it carries management implications. That's kind of the end of the book. Basically, it's like, well, if this stuff is so cool and it's necessary for so many critters, are we managing the land in a way that sustains this kind of post-fire environment? And the answer is not really. And there's things we can be doing before a fire burns, during a fire, when it's burning, in our firefighting, and after fire, our logging, post-fire logging, salvage logging. So those three areas, there's things we can do, I think, to be much more ecologically informed. And so that's how it ends, basically, with suggestions on how we could think about management a little differently.
Sure. No, thank you for that. Yeah, I was also lucky enough to have lived in Oregon, so I've seen a lot of burn forests and also out here in Colorado. But at first it was that kind of thing. This is shocking. There's something wrong, whatever. It's not that pleasing to the human eye. But then I started realizing, oh, wait a second, these are ecologically crucial. And over time, I did develop that eye for the beauty of it and seeing, okay, this dead component is the crucial structure. And then even seeing these recovering forests, oh, it's this way because of the snags, because of the soil regeneration, et cetera.
Right. And it's yeah, what's amazing is and it's not just the black stuff, but if you go in the fall after the first year after a fire, the colors are phenomenal. I mean, the wildflower show is unbelievable. I mean, why do we have plants that we call fireweed? I mean, that's where they occur. So you go in there and you look at this sort of thing, or you look at mountain hollyhock, or you look at lupin or whatever, just carpets of color. It's just amazing. Or you go in right away, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of mountain bluebirds. There aren't mountain bluebirds in mixed conifer forest. You can't show me a mountain bluebird in a mixed conifer forest. Burn it up, and they're all over the place. And so this transition, this transformation is what's amazing. And it's not what most of us like to think about, which is how the forest comes back. Oh, wow, I see greening up. Oh, wow, the forest is coming back. How wonderful. Well, wait a minute. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the wonderful that is the change from that boring, mature mixed conifer forest, right? I remember when Yellowstone Park burned. It was 1.5 million acres or whatever, 1988. And the first thing I thought was, wow, this park has been turned from the most boring park in the nation to the most interesting park in the nation. And the next year, 1.5 million visitors thought the same thing. And so you got to go into these things and to appreciate them. That's one of the problems, is most of us have never been in a burned forest. And I find the most successful approach I have to educating people is taking them into the field. And in 20 minutes, I can see a 180-degree shift in their view of the value of these burned forests. So the trick is, how in the heck do we celebrate these things? The second part of the title, learning to celebrate severe fire. How do we do this and not kill ourselves and be safe? We don't want, you don't want the kind of thing where 20,000 homes are burning up or whatever. And so this is the challenge that we have in the West, is you want to keep natural processes. This is, after all, disturbance dependent forests. That means they depend on disturbance. Those lodgepole pine, if they don't get burned up, they're not reproductively successful. So there's a lot of critters that depend on this severe fire. How do we let that happen and be safe at the same time? And it turns out that's not as big a problem as we all think it is. The research coming out of the fire lab here in Missoula shows that the probability a home burns, has most everything to do with the condition of the home itself, and not fuels out, even if it's close as 100 feet away. There's a lot we can be doing to be much safer. Sit back, enjoy the show, basically, like all things. Hey, it's the same thing with the sun. If we aren't careful, it'll kill us. But if you put sun off on, you can enjoy the show. It's the same kind of thing with fire. We got to learn how to live with it and understand that this is an essential process in a disturbance dependent system.
Makes 100% sense to me. Unfortunately, it's been a very difficult thing to communicate to a lot of the public. And I find that even folks who are forest protectors, environmentalists, as soon as it gets into fire, they get a little weird. And I find it the vast majority of people, before I talk to them or other information gets to them, they're like, yeah, 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 let's protect the green stuff. But that yucky stuff that's burned down, that's all terrible and whatever. So I think books like yours that are not necessarily taking a confrontational approach. I went through the table of contents, and certainly you do have criticism of land management, which is, I mean, that's most of what I do. But I think the idea of celebrating, teaching people to connect more and love and appreciate, not just aesthetically, also aesthetically, but
Yeah,
understand the biodiversity, the complexity, like you said, of taking landscapes that they expect to be a certain way and then they change and people don't like it. And it's like, no, no, no. Not only is this okay, this is good.
exactly. And you're right about the, fire. A lot of fire scientists, just don't see it this way. In fact, there's this incredible rift between groups of scientists, talking about whether they think this is natural or not. And some of it comes from studying different systems. So the folks that sort of started the conversation that everything's out of whack and, oh my gosh, we need to thin the forest and do that research came out of the Southwest, the very Southwest, like Flagstaff and South and into New Mexico. But that story doesn't apply to 85% of the forests in the West. And so we have to be careful about, misapplying one thing we learn in one forest to another forest. And you're right, even the conservation organizations, even the Nature Conservancy, and I was on the Montana board for a while, even they will say, they'll have a picture and say, oh, here's a blackened forest and a one that's been thinned, so it's sort of mixed severity, and then a green, and oh my gosh, if we could just get to the green, we'd be in great shape. Well, no, this is a conservation organization, right? And so, yeah, we have a long way to go, but we're getting there. I mean, I see signs all the time. It's not quite as divisive as it used to be, and I think people are kind of catching on. And we'll see. That's what I'm hoping. I think I was hoping this book would help push things over the edge, get the conversation, really going.
I think that it will. And yeah, I'm looking forward to reading it and putting it out there as far and wide as possible. As somebody who is in the trenches myself, trying to educate on this, and I'm not a scientist, I'm a science writer, I'm really an advocate. And yet I take everything that I say based on the science of folks like you. It is still a very difficult conversation to have with people because all you have to do to excuse any form of quote management, you just use the W word. You just say wildfire and it disarms everyone. It makes you look like a villain for
Yeah.
pushing it forward. So I live at about 8,500 feet directly adjacent to the Roosevelt National Forest. So most of this is actually lodgepole pine up here. So areas where scientists such as Thomas Veblen have found that the fire interval can be hundreds of years,
Yeah.
and it requires high severity wildfire. I know things can differ based on forest type, et cetera, but that's my understanding of the lodgepole up here. And yet still there is the talk about bad fire versus good fire. And
Yeah.
well, one particular question I want to ask you, because this has been I have to say, one of the largest obstacles has been, yes, a lot of conservation groups. I think they know better, but they're testing the waters. They don't want to say the wrong thing, whatever. But
Mhm.
media has been, I got to say it as a former journalist, has been pretty awful on this topic and almost willfully ignorant. Like I've made a name for myself as kind of a pariah for talking to these journalists and just saying, you might not want to frame it in this way. And here's this study, citation after citation. It's like they don't want to hear it. So I
Right.
guess my question is, you don't have to crap on media if you don't want to, but is there a way that advocates such as myself can better communicate to media on this topic?
Yeah, I think it's really focusing on the naturalness and necessity of severe fire. That sells itself. All we are is messengers. It's not our opinion. It's the bird's opinion, the mushroom's opinion, and the longhorn beetle and the bark beetle. These other critters. It's their opinion, and we're just passing along the message that we need to maintain this in our disturbance-dependent system. But you're right. I think there are interests out there that want us to believe that fire is bad, no matter what kind of fire. It's a huge fire industrial complex, basically. And just think about it. We've been, right off the baby bottle, we've been raised on Smokey Bear. I mean, if you look at the posters, you can go online and say, hey, I'm gonna look at old classic posters, and some of them are amazing. Here's Smokey Bear with a huge forest fire behind with red flames all over, and the headline is something like, "This waste weakens America." We've been inundated with this kind of message forever. It's morphed a little bit now. Now you get into what you talked about: good fire, bad fire. Good fire, bad fire. So what we're talking about is bad fire, I guess. And so, but there's an interest there. There's a group that has an interest to make sure that we think it's bad, because then you can do what you want to do. Well, now timber harvesting is in there. That's part of the complex, right? Firefighting's in there. That's part of the complex. And so, they're basically invested in having us think that this is a bad thing that we need to deal with somehow, treat somehow. But the way fire's changing these days, and it is changing, fires tend to be, on average, probably larger than they used to be. They're not more severe. You can't stick a thermometer in there and see the temperature go up. They're just like as severe as they've ever been. And the proportion of land burned severely has not changed that dramatically in the mixed conifer forest zone. As you go farther south toward, south into New Mexico, okay, the proportion seems to have inched up in those forests, but not in most forests. And so we've got this natural system that's doing its thing. We need to learn to celebrate it, I guess, is all I could say. I don't know how to crack this nut in terms of communicating with other journalists.
Well, that's why I really like the approach that it seems like you're taking in your book. So you're coming at it from birds. And from what I read, again, just from the introduction, the idea is you can hear birds pretty well. You can typically see them flitting around, as opposed to like lizards or something like that. So tell us more about how central birds are to this whole issue.
Yeah, they're really central. I study birds because the reason you're talking about, they're easily detectable. There's no other vertebrate organism on Earth that is as conspicuous as birds. I mean, if you go outside your window, I guess those are aspens, unless it's a painting out there or whatever. As soon as you go out, right, the first thing you're going to detect, if it's not another human, is a bird. I mean, they're going to be calling out, oh, gee, there's a crow, chickadee, chickadee, chickadee. And so I can be blindfolded, and within a football field around me, give you a 95% accurate list of what birds are there. And so then I can go run away and do another count, and so you can accumulate huge number of samples, independent samples, and have real statistical power. And in Montana, we have over 20,000 points we've visited through every vegetation type you can imagine. And this is where we got the information to understand that there are some things that are relatively restricted to severely burned forest conditions. They simply don't occur anywhere else. And that is really powerful. So the birds, blackback woodpecker is the champion, of course, but American three-toed woodpecker is pretty impressive too. And the mountain bluebird's pretty impressive. And Lewis's woodpecker is pretty impressive. And, anyway, so you can come up with a list of things that are relatively restricted to these conditions. And then they show traits or adaptations to living in that particular kind of condition. So, whether it's the thick bark or the cones at the top of the tree, the cones that don't open unless it's severe, the seeds that don't germinate unless it's severe, the mushrooms that don't sprout up unless it's severe, the beetles that don't colonize unless it's severe. So all these things are evolutionary stories, which are much stronger and much deeper than a typical tree ring fire scar study that goes back, maybe hundreds of years. If we're lucky, 1,000 years. Evolution goes back much deeper We don't have the interference of human caused land use, which is always utilitarian. And come on, we and Native Americans and others weren't managing the land for anything other than utilitarian purposes. And so you have to get back in evolutionary time to understand what really exists out there on the landscape in a natural sense. And that's kind of where I'm letting the birds do the talking and show me their coat and show me their foraging and on and on and on, and begin to understand exactly what's happening. It kind of hits you in the head, hits you in the face. You go, aha, I get it. I finally understand. It's that sort of thing.
That makes a ton of sense to me. Well, since you're a bird expert, let me just ask this for my own edification. The other day, I believe there were two ravens. I don't think they were crows. And
Mm-hmm.
one of them was doing a caw. The other one was sort of responding with like a gobbling croak, like,
Yeah.
what was going on? Were they both ravens? Was one a crow?
Probably both ravens. They have the weirdest, funniest little calls. I mean, the raven has a more of a gurgle instead of a smoother crow. But yeah, this time of year, I think all the kids are out and they all group together in big groups, and they're just goofing off and talking to each other and learning how to catch squirrels or whatever they're doing. I don't know. But yeah, up in Missoula here, it's the same thing. A lot of ravens, a lot of funny noises. It's just time to be out enjoying.
I never heard the two distinct voices before, and they were sort of doing a call and response. Mm-hmm. It sounded very different. And I was like, what? I couldn't figure out what was going on.
I think it's the time of year. Yeah. Just goofy things.
Yeah. They're pretty cool. I like when they're around. But one thing I wanted to mention about Smokey the Bear is there's actually this sign not too far from here driving along the road, and it's a U.S. Forest Service sign, and it says, "Fire destroys forests." That's literally what it says.
Yeah. Amazing.
And it's like,
amazing. We have one in Missoula, not right now, but it was a little while ago, that had a picture of a bunch of, ponderosa and lodgepole pine and others. And they're all black. They all burned. It's a black and charcoal landscape. And then in bold print across, it said, "Unfortunately, they couldn't run for their lives." And I'm going, what? They just got reproductive success. They finally reproduced. It's like,
yeah. And at this point, it almost seems bad faith, because it can't be that they don't know this. Now, what I will say is, of course, because it's about 85% of fires right now are human caused. And so preventing arson, preventing accidental fire, I'm on board with that. In fact, our organization, Eco Integrity Alliance, has been saying, let's shift some of the logging money over to more patrolling and maybe closing down some of these superfluous roads where people are going in that they're vectors for fire. But so I can understand the idea of let's educate people to not accidentally start fire. We're all on board with that, right?
Yep. And the percent started by humans is a continuum. It goes from near 100% near towns to all 0% out of towns. And so it depends on where you are. And yeah, we need to be doing everything in our power to reduce human caused fires, what happened in Southern California. It was, a fellow apparently started this thing, and then then the winds flamed it up again. But, those are the things we need to be preventing. Yep, for sure. I think, I'm not sure where I was thinking something else about the human caused fire. There's so much we can be doing. Like you're saying, redirecting some of our energy and our money, toward learning to live with something that's potentially dangerous.
Right. Well, out here, most of the attention, and from what I've been able to track, the funding is going towards what they call fuel reduction, all that sort of stuff. And I understand there's a variety of opinions on where and when, if at all. Personally, I'm pretty skeptical. And even if that's something that may in some cases be useful, I'm not personally convinced that the Forest Service is the entity to do it. But I understand the spectrum of views on this topic. So what I try to make the argument to people who maybe they don't have as hard line of view as I do on public lands, I try to say to them, okay, even if you think some of this might not be necessary, or at the very least, can we agree that this might not be the top priority, that we can focus on the communities and the homes first, and things like early warning systems, evacuation routes. Here in this town where I live, it's called Netherland, up against National Forest. So basically, they have done a lot of fuel reduction. They're planning a ton more. And a lot of this old stuff that they did, actually, it's a lot of clear cuts. So that there's all of this down woody debris. There's all these trees that are falling from the wind. The wind is blowing in. They're hot and dry, whatever. We have been talking about, let's have some better early warning systems, maybe even a siren, etc. We just had a sort of a dry run of what would happen the other day. So we actually had a shopping center in Netherlands. It's a very small town, but it was a fifth of the town's businesses did just burn down. So that was 2 days ago. So it was a fire. It wasn't a forest fire. It was a building fire. And what's funny is even the fire department acknowledges a lot of the spread didn't happen because, well, it wasn't windy. It was pretty moist out. It didn't have the conditions for spread. But anyway, many of us who are up in this area did not get notification about it.
Right.
And so it's like, that's step number one. They're not even doing step number one, but because, in my opinion, they're so focused on cutting trees down out into the forest. So I guess that wasn't a question, but if you have any comment on that.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of, it rubs me the wrong way to say it's a fuel reduction, because fuels have nothing to do with the fires that burn 98% of the land. We put out most fires, we do, and they don't go anywhere. But that increase in tiny fires, because we put them all out, is not associated with concomitant decrease in the giant fires. The giant fires are the same proportion they always have been, and that's because they are driven by wind, dry conditions, and temperature, high temperature. So those three things together determine whether those are going to burn. Fuels have nothing to do with it. So it just, on the other hand, I don't mind cutting, wood. It's a renewable resource. I don't mind doing it near town. Maybe that opens place up a bit, makes it look more park-like we have here outside Missoula and Patty Canyon. It's a great place to go hike and walk your dogs, and it's open, and probably under a mild year when it's not so windy, it probably helps, right? But don't tell me you're restoring the forest. Tell me you're thinning the forest, in the urban interface, and it's just going to, if anything, it'll make it a little safer. But you're not restoring conditions that used to exist, and there weren't wagon trains coming through with an open understory. Sorry, you got the wrong vegetation type if you're going to tell that story. So they're misapplying their justifications. But I see no problem saying, hey, we need to get some wood. Let's get some near town. That's probably the best place to do some thinning. And if anything, it'll make it possibly a little safer. Yeah.
The issue that I found, though, is that Trojan horse does not stop at the edge of town.
Yes.
And so right now in Colorado, and of course nationally, with the rollback of the roadless rule, if you read the press release that the Forest Service put out, or the Department of Agriculture put out right upon announcing that they were going to move forward with rescinding it, it mentioned wildfire 5 times. So in 4 paragraphs, or however many paragraphs. So their main talking point for being able to roll back the roadless rule. So again, where are roadless areas? Not near communities so much, right? Yeah. That's where they're going in. We have the biggest logging project, it appears to be in Colorado history. It's high elevation areas, and some of it's adjacent to communities. The problem is you have one cabin out in the woods, and they're like, it's all a community. It's like, well, debatable. But anyway, so what's your take on them taking a local kind of version of this out to the most far-flung areas?
Yeah, the farther into the outback, the less I think the justification holds. It simply isn't a good justification. There's plenty of wood to get if you need some wood. You don't need to be doing that out there. And this goes for firefighting too. We don't need to be out there fighting these fires in the middle of nowhere. Near town, okay, all right, but and certainly after fire. to go in and salvage log, to invent a word called salvage, meaning there is no value except for what we might get out of the wood, that's insane. There's not one single ecological benefit in salvage logging after fire. Not one has ever been published. I'm here listening. If anyone has a reference on ecology, I'm talking about now, then I'm willing to listen to that. But I've read dozens and dozens and dozens of papers. Not one has an ecological benefit in salvage logging. And there's plenty of wood, places to go to get wood. And communities don't capitalize on the ecotourism benefit that could be associated with severely burned forest that's near town. If we're lucky enough, like we were in Missoula, to have a huge fire, 7,500 acre, 5 miles out of town, that was a gift. In my lifetime, I'm never going to have that again. It was so amazing, so wonderful. 4,000 kids bust through there with the Montana Natural History Center, students studying, faculty studying, people living up the canyon that burned up, saying, I've never seen anything like this. This is so amazing. This is, thank you so much for this walk, that kind of thing. So we need to be prepared to let fires burn, enjoy them when they happen, if we all stay alive, basically. And I think we'll be fine. And we can still get our wood. There's still plenty of places to get a little wood. It's not that big a deal. The industrial forest lands in the Southeast can give us most of the wood. We shouldn't be depending on public land for that kind of thing, but it could be one of the many multiple uses that we allow, if and only if doing so doesn't compromise the integrity of the system that sustains us all. That's the problem. And that's the overarching law that the National Forest Management Act and other acts say that we need to be thinking about. Yes, we can do multiple things, but never if they compromise the integrity of the system. And burned forest is one system. The aftermath of a severe fire is one that we're not paying close enough attention to. And we are sacrificing the integrity of the system when we go mess around with these areas after a fire, and mess around with forests before the fire, and reduce the chance it's going to be a good severe fire later.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up the quote salvage logging, post-fire logging. I first became aware of that around 2000, early 2000s, after the Biscuit Fire in Oregon, and we were trying to fight some of that logging in roadless areas. What's interesting is that there can be a lot of people who will be skeptical of the quote thinning, and because it's a green forest, and they're like, I'm not so sure, or maybe not this heavy, or maybe not over here. But I found it a lot more difficult to, once a fire burns through a forest, to get people to understand that we shouldn't cut those trees down.
Yep, that's a hard one. Most people would say, oh, at least I don't mind you getting that.
Right.
And
that's what they always shift it over to. They're like, well, all right, don't cut the green stuff. You can go ahead and take this other stuff.
And in fact, but the reality is exactly the opposite. These severely burned forests are more valuable to me than old growth, and should be the last places, not the first place, we go to get our wood. There's too much stuff in there that is biologically unique. And if we just learn to appreciate the value of these things, there's plenty of green trees out there. You don't need to be going into these forests and cutting down the burned timber. Anyway, that's just my view, at least in the mixed conifer forest zone that I'm familiar with. Maybe it's really different in pure lodgepole where you are or something, and it isn't quite the same, but I don't know. I think there's plenty of places to go and get the wood. And the other thing is, if you go in after, then the other thing that happens is you tend to muck up succession in the successional process. So the forest will come back the way it wants if you leave it alone. But we tend to want to go in, not only take the wood and salvage log, but now we're going to do other things. We're going to start planting. We're going to start. There's nobody in America that doesn't like planting trees. It's absurd. It's like, what? We don't want big tree farms. That's not what public land is about. And we don't need the forest. Is fine. It's coming. Trust me. Wait 100 years. Don't wait 2 years. Wait 100 years. It'll be back. I guarantee you. And so even with climate change, I don't think it's to the point where everything's now going to be sterile forevermore. Show me a place where that is the case. It's not. And you got,
no,
as I said, you're going to have to wait 50 to 100 years to convince me, not 2 years. Right. Right.
Right. Well, the human time frame, yeah, and I think it's about human aesthetic, and people want forests to look a certain way. And I can understand if you have a favorite area and it
Yep.
burns, it might
Yep.
seem tragic.
Yep. It is. It
But
is.
people have to understand the ecology behind it. And there's an example not far from here, and we've been leading hikes out to it, to a great deal of controversy for whatever reason. It's an area that they had done thinning in the name of community protection. A wildfire burned through. It actually burned more severely in the area where it did the thinning. And again, severe fire is fine, but their whole purpose for doing the thinning was supposedly to reduce the severity. But regardless, there's areas around it that were not cut. Some of it didn't burn at all. Some of it did also burn severely, but there was a study done and then also going out on some of these lands to look at that. And the study, and both just eyewitness anecdotal, shows that the areas in which they did the thinning, the regrowth isn't so good, particularly even where they did some replanting. And their own studies found that the replanting did better in areas where there were more trees left that they hadn't cut, because it provided more shade and moisture. And I'm walking through this one place, it was on private land, and it had burned very severely. It burned severely, right? And so, oh, that's terrible, so to speak. It's this standing snag forest, and the regeneration is incredible.
Yeah.
It's beautiful,
Right.
and it's messy, right? There's stuff, sticks falling
Exactly.
down, but
Yeah.
it's alive.
Yeah. The heterogeneity after, during succession is important. And yeah, we can't be so uniform in our thinking. We have to line everything up and plant and yeah, the cones. Why are these cones at the tippy top of trees and they all open in severe fire? Well, that's where regeneration is occurring. And if you go in and cut them all down in a salvage log, you just ruined the chance of regeneration. So yeah, we need to be leaving things alone. Basically, the world's working pretty well. There are exceptions to think about, like climate change. The baseline seems to be moving. Things seem to be a little larger. What do we do about this? And the answer to that is, well, we do something about climate change. If you really care that things are changing, then you address the problem. You don't address that problem by saying you're going to thin more woods or something. That's what? That's totally unrelated. Okay, so climate change is an industrial issue. It's a human caused issue, and we have to deal with it that way.
Well, unfortunately, here in Colorado and elsewhere, they are saying that in order to deal with climate change, we have to cut more forests. So it's something
I don't get
we're
it.
back. I mean, yeah, I don't think it's backed in evidence, but it sells well. And I don't want to keep you much longer, but one piece I wanted to mention and see what you think. This is my own little personal theory on some of this stuff as to why it's such a hard sell to get even people who don't have conflicts of interest on board with the idea that fire, particularly severe wildfire, is a good thing ecologically. And I wonder if it has something to do with the human fear of death. We don't like seeing dead things because it reminds us of our own mortality. Am I going off base there? What do you think?
No, I think in most people's view, a severely burned forest is a definition of destruction and death. Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard for people to see it another way. That, oh my gosh, this is a restoration event. This is what's needed to transform the forest from state A to state B. And if we don't get this disturbance, we don't get that transformation. And then, so you have all these little things that live there from year 0 to 5, another whole set of things that come in year 5 to 10, another whole set of things come in year 10 to 20, another whole set 20 to 40, and on and on. So all the diversity of life on Earth is supported through these disturbance events. So once you begin to understand ecology, things become a little easier to grasp. And I think ecology is not what is driving our management priorities, for example. We used to have a thing called ecosystem management that was catching on in the early 90s, late 80s. And that was so amazing. It was wonderful. And man, did it faded fast for some reason. It just disappeared off the books. There is no ecosystem management anymore. But we need to be thinking more about ecology so that we can sustain the system that sustains us all.
Totally agree. And yeah, it's almost as if nature knows what it's doing, having
Yeah.
been around since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
And we humans maybe haven't figured out the secret of how everything works. And so maybe we should have some humility. But to that end, I have a new segment on the Green Root podcast where I ask folks what they think is a root, doesn't have to be the root, a root of the modern ecological crisis or crises, or however you want to frame that, things that are not necessarily going well in our relationship between humanity and the natural world. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about, are there any root causes and any foundations to that we can address? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there is a root cause. Now, whether we can address it or not is another question. The root cause is one and only one thing: human overpopulation. And if we could get a grasp on this, I'm sorry, we can't keep growing out toward the moon at the speed of light and expect that the Earth is going to be fine. We're sitting at 8 billion. When I started teaching 40 years ago, it was 2.5 billion. When I started teaching, we've been around as human beings for 500,000 years or something. When I started teaching, now we're twice the number that I started with. It's insane. As a global unit, we humans need to be concerned about this. And if anything, the trend these days is to say, oh my gosh, there's a lot of old people like me. We need to take care of them. We need more babies. It's like, oh my, so there's the fundamentally the most important issue that we face as human beings, and a very difficult one to address. Beside that, it would be the way each of us as individuals live. And sure, we can be more efficient, ecologically conscious. We don't need to be using so many fossil fuels and all those sorts of things. But boy, those things follow the problem of human overpopulation. You can fix all these how to live elements, but if you keep growing, I'm sorry, there's going to be a limit. There's back to ecology again. Human populations, any population, cannot grow forever. There must be a limit. No thinking person can possibly believe otherwise. So the only challenge is, when do you want to stop? How do you want to stop? And how are you going to do this? That's, I think, the biggest challenge we face. And I certainly don't have an answer to that. I wish I did.
I think those are things we definitely need to be paying attention to, and what we can do about them. Yeah, that's the tricky part, but that makes sense to me so far as roots of this crisis. So thank you so much for all of this information, all of the work that you've been doing. Where can people find your book, which again, the title is A Beautifully Burned Forest, Learning to Celebrate Severe Forest Fire?
Yeah, it's they could just type that in. It's on Amazon. It was published by Springer Nature. It's on their webpage too. Yeah, probably not in the nearest bookstore because Springer is an academic press, and so they tend to distribute to libraries at universities and things like that. So they don't. You probably won't find it in Barnes and Noble, but you can find it online easily. Yeah.
Well, I just started to read it, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of it. It is beautifully written, at least in the introduction thus far. So that's a
Great.
good start.
Hey, worked on that introduction. Great.
No, I could tell I write, and I definitely appreciated the writing. So yeah, so thanks again for everything, and thanks for coming on the Green Root podcast.
Yeah, thanks to you, Josh.